Hi, I'm Max Ruden, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. Warm welcome to LOA members and to all of you here tonight for supporting our work and these LOA Live programs. Tonight's program marks publication of this book, I Am the Arrow, The Life and Art of Sylvia Plath in 6 Poems by Sarah Ruden, who joins us tonight. A visionary writer whose bold and incandescent poems have struck a deep chord with generations of readers, Plath may best be understood, writes Sarah, an eminent classicist, as a modern mythmaker, an artist who at the peak of her powers transforms autobiography into superbly crafted poems that describe and embody the deep, timeless shapes of our shared experience. How do we read Plath's poems now, 60 plus years after her death at the age of 30? What's the relationship between her virtuosic accomplishment as a poet and the searing honesty of the poems, and between their witty playfulness and their shocking violence? Are we far enough away from her tumultuous life to begin to take the measure of Plath's poetic legacy? To explore these and other questions, we're joined by a distinguished panel. Sarah Ruden's many books include acclaimed translations of Virgil's Aeneid, Aristophanes' Lysistrata, and Augustine's Confessions, a biography of Virgil and a forthcoming biography of the martyr Perpetua. Her survey of writing against reproductive choice since the Roman Empire, Reproductive Wrongs, A Short History of Bad Ideas, is also forthcoming. She joins us from her home in Hamden, Connecticut. Biographer, critic, and novelist Heather Clark is the author of Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. She's also written The Grief of Influence, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and Sylvia Plath, A Very Short Introduction. Diane Seuss's 5 poetry collections include Frank, Sonnets, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award, and most recently, Modern Poetry, a New York Times notable book of 2024. She joins us from Kalamazoo, Michigan. Our moderator, Amanda Golden, is Associate Professor of English at New York Institute of Technology. She is co-editor of the Bloomsbury Handbook to Sylvia Plath and is currently co-editing The Poems of Sylvia Plath. She joins us from Northampton, Massachusetts, where she's a research affiliate at Smith College. We welcome your questions and comments and invite you to share your name and where you're tuning in from. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Now, please welcome Sarah Ruden, Heather Clark, Amanda Golden, and Diane Seuss. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Max. It's wonderful to be here today with Sarah and to celebrate her magnificent new book. I've been so excited to see all of the ways that she brings her expertise as a classicist to open up Plath's poems and approach them anew, drawing our attention in new ways to language, history, classics, and poetry. So first, I'd like to start us off by hearing from Sarah a bit. How did you come to write this book? What were some of the exciting things you found along the way? How is your response to myth part of this, or whatever you choose?
Uh, well, you know, the history of my writing this book really goes back to the time I was 11 or 12, and I started exploring women's literature. And I spent some years reading books by Mary Stoltz, who wrote books for teens. And by the time I was 16 or 17, I was just quite disgusted with that mode of writing about women. All of these books were about finding, at 15, 16, 17, the love of your life, who would take care of you forever. And this would be the last thing that you ever had to think about. Um, they were books of the 50s and 60s, and they had concerns that were typical for right then. Anyway, I was just very disgusted by their narrowness and their condescension, and was ready to read something very different. And then I came across The Bell Jar, and it just swept me off my feet. I'm going to read a little from the very beginning. This is the opening here. It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs. And I didn't know what I was doing in New York. I'm stupid about executions. The idea of being electrocuted makes me sick. And that's all there was to read about in the papers. Goggle-eyed headlines staring up at me on every street corner and at the fusty, peanut-smelling mouth of every subway. It had nothing to do with me, but I couldn't help wondering what it would be like being burned alive all along your nerves. So, of course, that's quite ironic because she's going to have primitive electroshock therapy. The speaker here is going to be, in a sense, electrocuted. So this book is about everything. It's about the horrible things people do to each other. It's about the horrors of modernity. It's about the treatment of women in particular. And uh, she puts herself right in the middle of the big picture. She dares to do that, even though she's a woman, even though the character here is a very young woman. She makes herself meaningful in the boldest, most assertive way. And I was just enthralled by it. So I was really thrilled to be able to write an introduction to her, and through the poems. And I really, being a classicist, I was trained to look carefully at form. So I had always admired her virtuosity and her hard work. She seems to have worked like very few people have worked, very few writers have worked since antiquity. So I'm a great admirer, and really treasured the chance to share my thoughts about her.
Thank you. I agree. Um, I'd like to shift now and focus in on some of the poems you chose. I was very excited with how much you did with each of the poems you chose and how you used each of these anchors to spiral to all sorts of fascinating places that explored all of Plath in a nutshell with an eye to the classics. So I thought we'd start with mushrooms. Sarah, would you like to read it?
Sure. Overnight, very whitely, discreetly, very quietly, our toes, our noses, take hold on the loam, acquire the air. Nobody sees us, stops us, betrays us. The small grains make room. Soft fists insist on heaving the needles, the leafy bedding, even the paving. Our hammers are rams, eyeless, earless and eyeless, perfectly voiceless, widen the crannies, shoulder through holes. We diet on water, on crumbs of shadow, bland-mannered, asking little or nothing. So many of us, so many of us. We are shelves, we are tables, we are meek, we are edible. Nudgers and shovers in spite of ourselves. Our kind multiplies. We shall by morning inherit the earth. Our foot's in the door.
Thank you. I love how you read that. It's so eerie, yet also the sound play, which you talk about in the book, was so apparent in your reading too. One place I thought it would be interesting to start is your opening line of the book about how you say the words just leap off the page. And I thought maybe that could be a way to begin. And I'd like to open it up for Diane and Heather to respond in terms of mushrooms or associations you'd like to make in response to mushrooms and your impression of it, or responses to Sarah's reading of it.
Heather, go for it.
Okay.
I feel like I'm in the presence of greatness with,
Oh, please, I feel that way too.
and I'm just sort of sitting here going, the, so go for it, Heather.
That's how I feel. No, Sarah, I loved your reading of this poem. I think it's very underappreciated in Plath's oeuvre. I'm so glad you gave it the sustained attention that you did. And it, she writes it at Yaddo, and it's during that time where she's by herself. She's not sharing a space with Hughes, right? She has her own study. They're apart for long stretches of the day, and that really behooves her. And we see here now the short lines, right? Beginning these sort of longer, more elaborate lines, and the brittle syntax. It's starting to disappear a bit, and she seems to be breaking through into something with these tercets. And I she wrote this poem after James Mischie had asked her for her poetry manuscript. He was from a young editor at Heinemann. And so I always read that sort of ending, like her foot's in the door, that sort of biographical, very, naughty biographical way of reading that last line, like my foot's in the door. But I suppose I tend to read it as a kind of feminist prophecy, and this sort of, it's like a political poem disguised as a nature poem, disguised as a political poem. It's, yeah, I mean, it seems to promise this reversal of hierarchies, however you want to call that. And there's an interesting Cold War surveillance theme going on there too. I think, like, nobody sees us, stops us, betrays us. It's I read Plath very much as a Cold War poet, and increasingly so as I'm doing more work on her. I think she's such a political poet, and we haven't quite gotten our minds around that, because we always think of her as like a confessional poet. So, but the personal is the political, right?
It is. Yes, indeed. Yes.
That's why the term confessional is so limiting in talking about any poet. I like what Sharon Olds says, that of her work, that she is apparently autobiographical. She uses apparently there, but Plath certainly, when I was a young writer, and I took a course called Modern Poetry, and everybody that was taught was male except for Sylvia Plath. And the inference, all the guys in the class said, she's psychotic, she's crazy. And so you either lined up with the men or you lined up with the crazies. I went for the crazy, and then began to realize, as I read her and as I grew up, that that her work was not at all crazy. In fact, it was one of the sane points in my reading life. One of the things I notice in this poem is the sound play. And there's almost that thing she does that's almost the nursery rhyme, the warped children's record, the sounds of ooze, and the metrical movement too of the poem feels creepily young and haunted. And then the other thing that really interests me in this poem, and in your take on Plath, Sarah, is the class issues that I had never really realized until you lit it up for me in this book, that Plath identifies with the lower classes, with the working class. And her mother maybe did a lot to sort of cover that up about them, but she was a worker. She was, she was a worker as a poet, and she was a working class person. And when I see that in the mushroom image, that, we're a unit and we're coming for you. So,
Mm. Yeah, Heather could say a lot about that. I think what seems to me to be, particular ironies in her life is that she was um, definitely of the professional classes, and her both parents had worked very, very hard to put themselves in that place. But after her father's death, her family was desperately poor. They just didn't know how they were going to pull this off. Um, and um, her husband, who affected um, the earthy Yorkshiremen, was actually from a family who were uh, better off than most people. And most people were pretty desperately poor there during the Depression. But Hughes's parents were shopkeepers.
mm,
And Hughes was never hungry while his classmates were. And so it's just a kind of amazing, complex of contrasts and strains, when you think about her identity and her relationships. Um, yeah, and I think played out in so many interesting tensions in her work.
Yeah, and one thing I just jumping on that point, it bothers me when I read descriptions of Plath as, kind of she like this neurotically hard worker. She was a perfectionist. She was addicted to achievement like an alcoholic is hooked on booze. I've read things like that. She had to keep her scholarship, right?
Mm,
I mean, she was a
yeah.
scholarship girl at Smith.
Mm,
She had a Fulbright to Cambridge. She had to work hard. She had to keep up the grades. It's like she didn't have a safety net. So the class
yeah,
issue is huge in Plath's life. And, being from a different class and going to a Seven Sisters school and then going to Cambridge and having to pass, which she had
yeah.
to pass all the
mm,
time. She went to dinner parties with T.S. Eliot.
mm.
I mean, she was an immigrant's daughter. Like,
Yeah, and she was a woman among a lot of male poets, a lot of powerful male poets. She thought, and probably correctly, that she had to, work twice as hard and be twice as good, like the old feminist
Yep.
motto.
And she was.
Yeah.
was, and she was, and
And
then
she was.
some.
I
Yeah.
feel like that speaks to the paradox, in the poem too, that, mushrooms aren't going to just stick their foot in the door. They're taking over, they're multiplying.
Mm,
It highlights their toughness too,
Mm,
which is there with Plath. Like she affected a lot of things to appear as she thought she should be, but she was also incredibly tough.
mm, yeah,
Incredibly.
yeah.
Um,
that image of the mushroom, it's fungal, it's earthen, it's down there in the roots. It's sort of the duende image,
Mm,
so, it's it's beyond grounded. It's of the ground.
mm,
And I think this poem was a big influence on what I think is another great post-war poem, Derek Mahan's A Disused Shed in County Wexford, which is all about mushrooms. So go read that if you haven't. I think Plath is a big influence on that poem.
Mm,
mm.
should we shift over to The Applicant, which is
sure.
another tough, strong
Mm,
poem?
Mm.
Yeah. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, please.
Okay. The applicant. First, are you our sort of person? Do you wear a glass eye, false teeth, or a crutch, a brace or a hook, rubber breasts or a rubber crotch, stitches to show something's missing? No, no? Then how can we give you a thing? Stop crying. Open your hand. Empty? Empty. Here is a hand to fill it, and willing to bring teacups and roll away headaches and do whatever you tell it. Will you marry it? It is guaranteed to thumb shut your eyes at the end and dissolve of sorrow. We make new stock from the salt. I notice you are stark naked. How about this suit? Black and stiff, but not a bad fit. Will you marry it? It is waterproof, shatterproof, proof against fire and bombs through the roof. Believe me, they'll bury you in it. Now your head, excuse me, is empty. I have the ticket for that. Come here, sweetie, out of the closet. Well, what do you think of that? Naked as paper to start, but in 25 years she'll be silver, in 50 gold. A living doll, everywhere you look. It can sew, it can cook, it can talk, talk, talk. It works. There's nothing wrong with it. You have a hole, it's a poultice. You have an eye, it's an image. My boy, it's your last resort. Will you marry it? Marry it. Marry it.
I love your recitation there. um, yeah.
I love how you situated this too as Plath being that student prepared for interviews and professionalism, because Hughes would probably just sort of be his casual self and be impressive to people. And one thing too about this poem is that Plath wrote it, I assume, in the morning early, the day Hughes came later to take his things. Then the next day she wrote Daddy. So it's a real pivot point for her. And it's almost as if, I don't know if she knew he was coming, but it's almost as if he's coming for this interview and the marriage question is on the table, not on the table, but this is on her mind in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Scathing, subversive satire of marriage, the phony, jingly language of the like the ad man advertisement, which she obviously knew well from Mademoiselle, which caused her to have a nervous breakdown. She being in that phony world, right? Even for 4 weeks, not that that was everything, but that wasn't good for her. She said of this poem, I just want just a couple sentences. She said, Plath called the speaker, quote, an executive, a sort of exacting super salesman. He wants to be sure the applicant for his marvelous product really needs it and will treat it right. That's her, those are her ironic words there.
Yeah.
Right.
Sarah, I loved your use of the word huckster voice. As I read the three poems we selected to speak about today, none of them are I poem. Isn't that right? None of the poems that we're talking about. The mushrooms are a persona, and this is the huckster speaking, and then we'll get to the last poem in a little while. But this is another persona, and it allows her as a writer a certain kind of diction that is really intense and wild and different from her own apparent voice. So that's one thing I love about it is it's just so it allows her so much leverage to intensify her language.
Mm. Yeah. Um,
Performance. It's a
mm.
performance, like Lady Lazarus in that way, you know.
Yeah, it's wonderful what you say about the absence of the eye in these three poems. Even when she uses the eye and has, very strong a persona with a very strong eye, as an elm,
Mm-hmm.
uh, or um, mm, there there are um there are a lot of them, but they always have a very um they have a powerful and imaginative persona. It's
Yes.
not limited to her. You
Mm,
know, the
yeah.
the young mother with the two children and the um, ambition to write and publish and so on. They just take you somewhere, to an absolutely different place, into a more universal place. And we're about to go on to Edge, and um, there the feet are speaking. We have
Mm,
come so far. It is
mm-hmm.
over. That's a we.
Yes.
It suddenly becomes about women. It suddenly becomes about death, about everyone who dies. Um, um, she just keeps, um, this is what Hughes wrote when he wrote about Shakespeare. He just kept opening.
Mm.
This is true. This is true of Sylvia Plath.
This is why the term confessional is so limiting,
Mm,
because she her the self is mythologized and made it has such largesse in her work. It's not walking around Sylvia Plath. It's it's a mythological invention, which is the point, I think, in many of your essays here.
mm,
She's a master of irony and performance.
Mm-hmm.
And I
mm,
think we don't necessarily grant her that irony that I find in so many of her poems and in the Bell Jar. I mean, so much irony between Sylvia Plath and Esther. I mean,
mm,
she's really looking back at that and figure with sort of, yeah, I think a sort of playful irony. But absolutely, I think the confessional label is limited. And I think it's particularly dangerous for poets like Plath and Anne Sexton, who
Mm-hmm.
suffered from mental illness and died by suicide. It doesn't capture their sense of literary sophistication and bookishness and their sense of vocation, right?
Yeah.
Irony, use of irony.
mm. Yeah, a poem here like The Babysitters, which you might, casually call autobiographical. And you can, take your chapter, Heather, about that summer, and sort of link up facts, fact by fact by fact. Um, and yeah, she draws in great detail on what actually happened. But like the speaker there and Esther are like, now I'm thinking, they're like paper dolls. You would put outfits on them. You know, um, Esther has this borrowed skirt that she wears home, and that the outfits, the different things that she wears, the evening dress that she can't really afford, but she went out and impulsively bought all these clothes for her um, wonderful, what was supposed to be a wonderful time in Manhattan. Um, yeah, and she moves these figures around, very skillfully, um, but at arm's length.
Mm-hmm.
She's ironic, she's funny as all get out, and she's meaningful. She connects. in a way that I'm sure, Sylvia, um, in the midst of a terrible depression did not, when she was so young.
Even a poem like Daddy, which is so maligned, how mean she was to her father, you know, clearly not a poem about, it's some of the images are derived from her father's life and from their relationship, but it's so much bigger than that. It's the fathers, it's the daddies. And to see a woman writing that, or the applicant, in what, 1960, early, I mean,
Yeah.
my God, the guts, the bravado is just amazing. That Daddy, I think, is one of the most misunderstood poems in her uh, great body of work.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, she was one of the first poets to, I mean, helped introduce female anger into the poetic lexicon. She wrote about miscarriage. She wrote about abortion, postpartum depression. Anne Stevenson called her the first great poet of childbirth in the language. She wrote about motherhood, pregnancy, the fetus. Sarah, as you mentioned, not mentioned, but you wrote about in your essay, wonderful essay on and how subversive this was to write a pregnancy poem
Mm.
about a fetus,
Right.
at that time, right? I mean, she was doing
Mm.
all these sort of proto-feminist things, really opening the door for the women who came after.
Mm.
I'm very, very grateful to her. And I read her poems about motherhood now. I have 2 children, and they still seem radical to me, radical and subversive in this culture that sentimentalizes motherhood. And I turn to Sylvia Plath for some bracing truth sometimes.
Right. Yeah. I wrote when I was I don't know if I mentioned it when I don't think I mentioned it in the essay about your, but one very important account, a fictional account of childbirth is Tolstoy's. And Kitty, is it, who's giving birth, and her young kind of dorky husband is in a total panic. And the doctor's very calm and he's freaking out and flipping out, and all he can hear, all he knows about is the screaming that he hears.
Hmm.
And that passes, in this great book in this great author for a story about childbirth. It's just, I don't know, when I think about it, I feel really insulted.
Thank
Why?
God for free women, right?
Right, yeah. Why do women's account of this incredibly important event, why does it get kind of left out completely? And that wasn't very many decades, before Sylvia Plath wrote. She didn't have really a precedent. She just seized that moment. She did it. She was so brave.
That line, "You are the baby in the barn," in Nick and the Candlestick, that comes to me all the time. I have a son, and he's
Mm,
a man now, but he's been through a lot. And you are the baby in the barn. It's the bees, you are the baby in the barn. And
mm,
it has such depth of feeling.
mm.
Do we shift over to Edge?
Edge.
Okay. I don't know if I'm up to this task, but okay. The woman is perfected. Her dead body wears the smile of accomplishment. The illusion of a Greek necessity flows in the scrolls of her toga. Her bare feet seem to be saying, "We have come so far, it is over." Each dead child coiled, a white serpent, one at each little pitcher of milk, now empty. She has folded them back into her body as petals of a rose close when the garden stiffens and odors bleed from the sweet, deep throats of the night flower. The moon has nothing to be sad about, staring from her hood of bone. She is used to this sort of thing. Her blacks crackle and drag.
Oh, that was great. You were certainly up to it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One of the great poems in the language, isn't it?
It is.
Mhm.
Mm.
I liked how both Sarah and Heather treated balloons in relation to this poem too. That they both are sort of part of the same moment, and thinking about how Plath was navigating that time and thinking through her poems.
Yeah, it's I think did I write something like readers are often surprised that she wrote these poems on the same
When
day, right? That
I remember you gave more time to balloons than I think it has ever received. And then Sarah took up
Mm.
the mantle of that. And I also, my other favorite part of Sarah's reading of this poem is talking about Plath's death, which is so hard, but also imagining the bread and whether Plath baked it. And I felt like that brought us back to her domestic, well, Marcia Bryant would call it her domestic sublime, but her, methodical feeling to do everything herself. I mean, before that, but even the materiality of her domestic life is something that factored into your reading, which I thought was great.
Yeah, you have these very comforting images that go through the poems. Because in your there's the image of the proverbial bun in the oven,
yeah.
the loaf, the high riser. And you see her there, she's pregnant, and you have this image of her baking bread, waiting for just waiting. You have to wait, until the loaf rises. Um, and you get the sense, in that poem of all of the patience, that it took to live her life. She's waiting, she's at home, she's got drawers, she's got spools, in the drawers, she's waiting for the mail. She's waiting to hear about her submissions. And she's building, building, waiting, waiting. And the objects around her comfort her. She was very domestic in that way. She liked to have nice things. She liked to have things well arranged and beautiful around her. And you can in a way you can think of the poems that way. Um, she made them beautiful. She made them entertaining. She liked to entertain,
Hmm.
or she at least felt she had a duty to entertain well, to cook well, to make people feel good about being in her home. Um, and this is all, these things that are um, normally considered just very ordinary female attributes are a great part of her genius. She just elevates them. So she elevates, the little aesthetic touch that you would um, contrive in decorating into, the unforgettable line.
Mhm.
It just goes together so well. It's so perfect.
What kind of edge is this?
Well, she started out with it was Nuns in Snow, and then it became The Edge, and then she just got rid of the, and then it became Edge, right?
Mm.
It just feels like I think was it Judith Kroll who called it an interstellar tableau, and I love that phrase. And to me, it feels like a classical frieze.
Yes.
Mm.
I was
It,
so interested, Sarah, in your how you opened that up with all the classical imagery that knowledge that you brought to that poem.
Yeah, it kind of felt like maybe this was just me, but it felt like a cenotaph. It felt like a tomb,
mm,
um, especially an altar to the dead with the pictures of milk and snake. Snake comes from the underworld and drinks the milk. It's a good omen. Um, so I was thinking along those lines, but I could have been just imposing my background, my training um, on the poem. I don't really know.
Well, one thing I think is important that readers know about Edge is that it's often read as a suicide note, right?
Mhm.
It's one of, I think it's one of the most biographically determined poems in the English language. People read it literally as a suicide note,
Mm.
and it's not. I mean, it is such, it's many, many things, but there are so many literary allusions in this poem, right? If you annotated it, you find allusions to Yeats's "He Wishes His Beloved Were Dead," D.H. Lawrence, Shakespeare. I mean, it's a very, to me, it's a very Sarah Teasdale, very literary poem, very literary, and which again is part of the irony of the confessional, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, it certainly tells us about her priorities, her purpose in life. Um, she didn't, of course, write a suicide note as such. She wrote a note instructing whoever found her to summon the doctor, which, puts into question whether she did, in fact, mean to commit suicide. It may have been a suicidal gesture. She may have meant to be rescued. But there was no room in her life for, or maybe no interest in, um, uh, you know, writing a conventional suicide note. I hate your guts. You did this. I want this arrangement and that arrangement made, for the children, for my things, for my archive. Um, she didn't do that. That wasn't on her list. What she needed to do was write, some really exquisite poems within not many days of her death. And she needed to take care of her children. She needed to, feed them, bathe them, make them safe while she, um, you know, gassed herself. But she didn't need to do, apparently, didn't feel like doing something as ordinary as, expressing her wishes should she in fact die.
The what's the first line again, Heather, of this poem?
Um, the first line, let me make
The
sure I'm
woman is perfect.
correctly. I don't want to misquote it.
Perfect.
Yeah, the woman is perfected.
Yes,
But I
and
read so ironically, but yeah.
yeah, and we hear it in another poem, perfection is terrible, it cannot have children, right? So this the perfect the haunting of women by perfection and having to be pushed to be perfect. I mean, the woman is perfected. Well, she's perfected because she's stone. She's dead, or she's sculptural. She's not real. She's not flesh anymore. And that opening gambit just always seemed really important to me. If you look uh, at her work, you can almost draw a line and make a chart of the white images of stone and opiates and all of that up against the red, the red poppies and the blood jet and all of that, and red being the comet flying into the um into the horizon versus this kind of stillness and silence. um so there's something really sophisticated in that, in what she did with images, in terms maybe of her own consciousness, her own interior, but also her use of the image. And this poem certainly fits into that stillness, stone. And what does the moon have? Her blacks crackle and drag. How do you hear that? line and see that image.
Mm.
That's
Um,
that assonance and consonance kind of
Mhm.
that really heady combination, right? Of the soft A's and the K's and something sinister and regal about it.
Yeah.
yeah.
You know, she doesn't say her black cape cracked.
No.
She just, her blacks, you know, what a brilliant move.
Yeah. Well, I thought she was, I was, first I didn't like those lines because they sounded a bit tacked on. They sounded inconsequential. And then I thought, no, that's what's brilliant about them. This is
Mhm.
a, um, um, just a, irritating, boring mourner, you know, someone who might as well not even be there. Um, and so we're looking, at the moment of what she's wearing. She's wearing black, and they crackle and drag. This is not nice clothing. Um, and again, I'm thinking of the way she dresses up figures. And
It's the
this is
moon. I mean, it's above, it's almost the goddess, you know, but
mm,
the moon thinks none of, what is that line? The moon thinks nothing of, what is it,
Yeah,
Heather?
the moon has
nothing.
nothing to be sad about,
Mm,
staring from
Yeah,
her hood of bone.
mm,
yes, her hood of bone. Um,
That starkness. Yeah.
there's a
mm,
cold, there's a coldness in the reception of this death. Um, you
mm,
know, and it's she's, that moon is above. It's the, feels like a judgment.
mm,
Helen Vendler wrote a brilliant essay about this poem that changed the way I thought of it. And I just feel like I come back to it all the time. She called it protective. She used that word, that there's a very protective element to this poem where the speaker talks about folding them back into her bodies as petals of a rose closed when the garden stiffens and odor bleeds. It's almost like this protective gesture towards her children.
Mhm.
Like the world is chaos and I'm enfolding, back into this this safety, this system. And so yeah, Helen Vendler really kind of broke that poem open for me.
I
It's
mm.
need
a
to
coming
look.
of age as a poet. If you haven't read it, it's a brilliant essay.
Yeah.
Okay,
But for
yeah.
me, there's a great contrast in, the speakers, um, not 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 the speaker, no, the main figure's role as a mother, and I agree, it's very tender. Um, and then the mother figure, the moon watching from below, and she's normally a judge, and she's normally somebody who is disappointed. Um, somebody who sad for herself because she works so hard and yeah, and she has no control over this troublesome daughter. Um, so you have this contrast, which I think is very interesting. And the garden is very the cemetery images, the garden image, it's all kind of beautiful. And then you have this moon in this ugly dress, um, ugly, noisy dress. Um,
Yeah.
but she doesn't matter at this point. This is all sort of floated past her into eternity. The scene of beauty, of love that is what lasts here.
I hate to cut us, but we have some questions, and I think it's in the spirit of this poem too. And I love how you position this poem and Ariel as both an end and a beginning, because while she's come so far, it's over. The poem lives on every time one reads it.
Mm,
Um, and
mm,
so we have some questions. So I'd like to open up the floor to some of our attendees. We have a bunch of questions about Ted Hughes. And so we could see what we want, how you want to go with this. So Beth from Westchester, Pennsylvania asked how Sylvia Plath's relationship with Hughes affected her poetry. And then Connor from Mesa, Arizona also wondered how Hughes had a hand in preserving her legacy or sort of hampering it. And also Forrest from Asheville asked how why there's negativity toward him. So I think those things are intertwined because he was there, and Heather's book about their productive relationship is so good on this because he was there. But then there are sort of mixed feelings about whether he has preserved or hampered or both some of her posthumous reputation and life. I mean, she wouldn't be who we know her as without Ted Hughes. But also then why is there negativity? So maybe we could answer some of this Ted Hughes information as it relates to your work.
Yeah, I think Heather would be the person to, address this as, the great expert who, gave us this magnificent biography. It hasn't been possible until now for, people who are not academic research experts on Sylvia Plath, and maybe even not even those, to know so much about her and be able to think about her in such a balanced way. I'd really like Heather to speak to this.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge question. I feel it's hard for me. I mean, I wrote a book about their relationship, so it feels very, very difficult for me to answer that question in a succinct manner. But I think, well, part of the reason they were attracted to each other is was it was aesthetic. It wasn't just this, physical attraction. They saw something in each other's poetry that they admired, and they sort of became this team, and they wanted to shock British poetry out of submission. They were both against the movement, which was kind of the dominant way of writing poems in the mid to late 50s in England. They didn't think the poems were sort of bold enough. They had this much more Laurentian vision, more Yeatsian vision of what a poem should be, kind of and so they were like the punk rockers of their day, they were like they wanted to shake things up and write a different kind of poetry. And there are these wonderful letters of Plath is saying all these nasty things about Marion Moore and how she can't handle writing about sex in her poems, but her husband can. And so they really were sort of this team early on. And there's a kind of unity of vision. And in my book, I go into how they influenced each other. And it went both ways. It wasn't just Hughes to Plath. It really went both ways. Later, after the marriage became really destructive, and it ended terribly. And so um, it was very, I think, productive until it was destructive. And after she died, he inherited the estate, and so he was the one who he promoted her work and tried to get it published wherever he could. He felt a lot of guilt after her suicide. He called himself a murderer. I mean, he was just, I think, shattered. So he used his connections to get her published, but he also changed the order of her Ariel manuscript, and he made it a much more kind of gave it a much bleaker trajectory. In Plath's real version of Ariel, she started with the word love, from Morning Song, love set you going like a fat gold watch, and she ended with the word spring. So she had this very kind of trajectory of rebirth and transcendence in her version of Ariel, and Hughes changed that and made it like this downward slide and ends with the bleak poems. And so that presented a version of Plath to the world that wasn't really accurate. And so, yeah, I mean, he did damage that in that way, but I think he also he helped her gain a reputation. I mean, he put his own reputation behind it. So it's really complicated.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, they're difficult to forgive, I think, for um, devoted readers of Plath was his destruction of some of her writing. Um, he admits to having burned one journal. He says he lost another. And he edited her um he took all of her journals and that were left and edited them in a way that pretty transparently um um was pretty transparently meant to save himself embarrassment. um um you know uh well justified criticisms of her behavior. um his behavior toward herself are not in that version. um so um yeah, he has been for those reasons very deeply resented, by people who are attached to Plath.
There's so much
Read
in their
my book.
story. Oh, what'd you say?
I said, read my book on Sylvia Plath. I said,
Yes.
if you want more,
Good.
I wrote, a 300-page book about it, so go.
Yes. I just wedge in here that hers then it becomes a story of a woman who worked really hard in that domestic realm, and then he ended up resenting her for her domesticity. The wildness of her biting his cheek when they met, or that, as happens to many of us in marriage, that that was tamed by the domestic, and that turned him off. And I think a lot of readers see themselves in that trajectory of sort of doing what it is expected of you and then being blamed for it. um I mean, there it is.
Mm.
Seems like the appropriate place, an appropriate place to leave. A really great conversation. Thank you so much. That was really, really revelatory conversation about the poems and about Plath. Um, you've been listening to Heather Clark, Amanda Golden, Diane Seuss, and Sarah Ruden discuss Sarah's new book for Library of America, I Am the Arrow, The Life and Art of Sylvia Plath in 6 Poems. I hope you'll join us on Thursday, May 8th, as LOA Live welcomes Phil Cly, former Marine and author of the National Book Award winning story collection Redeployment, and Elizabeth Samet, professor of English at West Point, for a conversation exploring Professor Samet's edition of 5 classic memoirs from World War II's European theater for the Library of America series. The program marks the 80th anniversary of VE Day. Details and links to register can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about the Library of America volumes mentioned in tonight's program and links to purchase them and other volumes of great American writing. LOA Live is made possible with support from Library of America members and viewers. We're grateful to everyone here tonight for joining us. LOA members receive special discounts, invitations to exclusive events, and other benefits while supporting Library of America's nonprofit mission. You can learn more at loa.org/membership. Thanks so much again to each of you, really, for a terrific conversation. And I hope you all, and I hope everybody here tonight has a great evening. Thanks very much.